So could you talk a little bit about your role as associate artist at the Gate Theatre and about the piece you created there called Prayer?
Yeah, so I'm one of 5 associate artists at the theatre, and that's made up of like directors and casting directors and me as a designer. And the role is like super interesting, kind of in comparison to the way that I kind of normally work on projects, which is normally quite kind of quick and short, and the thinking is kind of very specific to a text or a show. And in as a working as an associate artist, it's much kind of longer form thinking about the organization, but also kind of gives me a space to be paid, I suppose, to kind of think in a more explicitly political and more kind of expansive way about the possibilities of scenography. So a lot of what that job kind of entails really is just like long conversations with a big group of people. And then there's been other things that have kind of been part of that, like running workshops. But the most kind of tangible thing that has come out of that relationship is making this piece Prayer, which was an idea that I had, which was about, what would it mean to kind of grow a garden rather than make a show, and grow a garden in the space of the Gate Theatre, which was very kind of rich as an idea because it kind of opened up a lot of ideas around like process and kind of about the climate crisis, like because the project was really a kind of 3-year long kind of process. It kind of asked me to be incredibly kind of rigorous about that process in a way that I'm maybe not able to in my other work. So specifically kind of in relation to questions around the climate crisis, it was like, is this even a kind of sustainable idea? So anyway, the project kind of proved to be impossible in a lot of ways, but sort of became became possible when the theatre closed, which was this kind of interesting contradiction. And so I decided to make what now kind of like looking back on is like almost like a kind of self-published zine or something. There was something about having to publish that myself and kind of voice that myself, that meant that there wasn't the kind of barriers that you might normally have to kind of design-led work. And also I was able to kind of talk very directly and kind of very intimately to the audience about this idea about design and about process and about my process. And
So you wrote an article for the Stage newspaper last year on the politics of space, which kind of had similar areas to what you're talking about in Prayer. I wondered if you could kind of elaborate a bit on those themes.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that was kind of like has been like kind of troubling me in my work, or that I wasn't like fully able to kind of articulate or express to begin with, was like that I didn't find that I had the room to kind of fully interact, like either kind of materially or with my ideas, with the kind of realities of the spaces that I was working in, and the way that spaces, theatre, like not site-specific spaces, but the way that kind of theatre spaces were spoken about, or the kind of way I was approaching them creatively, was as if they were kind of these neutral spaces, essentially, that anything could happen in, and all you kind of need to do is like put up some masking, and then you have a kind of almost like floating void, almost without politics or without history or something. And that kind of, I had this kind of emotional sense of that being very troubling, but didn't immediately kind of find the ways to kind of creatively, I think, kind of discuss that in my work. And yeah, so I kind of had a series of 3 projects with Ellen McDougall, all of which I kind of think allowed me to think about that with a little bit more articulacy. And I think that is also to do with kind of long form thinking, I think, rather than like jumping from project to project. But what I kind of, maybe the clearest version of this is The Wolves, which is a play at the Theatre Royal Stratford East, which is like a very, almost like chocolate boxy kind of perfect Victorian proscenium arch theatre. When I kind of first did my site visit to that space, I felt kind of like very physically uncomfortable and in some ways kind of angry with the proposition that this space might be in any way empty, with the kind of very specific signifiers that it contains of both a period in British history, which is like deeply kind of connected to like very violent forms of colonialism, and also how kind of inherently classist, I suppose, those spaces are. And you know, you have different areas that the audience sit in. Anyway, there's like a lot that I kind of found troubling about that space, and the kind of way that I approached thinking about interacting with the politics of that specific space was to make something. It's like this huge, the set for The Wolves is this huge kind of inflatable mint green set, was to really use that set as like my subjectivity very loudly kind of like interacting with the subjectivity of that space. And I suppose that's a kind of an attempt to kind of render what might feel invisible about a space or about the politics of a space kind of visible through scenography. And I think it's about like this, I mean, it's like so huge and so rich, this kind of idea of like how scenography can like fully interact with the different politics, different kind of forces that are operating on a space. But I think the first little kind of tentative work that I feel like is important is just kind of rendering some of these things visible and finding spaces to kind of to kind of really expose the fullness of them. I guess it's like the fullness of my subjectivity meeting the fullness of that space. And that it's not even just that kind of I found it uncomfortable or kind of morally like challenging. I also think it's like creatively quite limiting to kind of always imagine that we're starting from zero. And what are the kind of new creative offers that kind of come from like actually really almost like treating the space with as much, the kind of existing space with as much kind of intrigue and detail as we might do a kind of text or something. And then with prayer, I suppose the way in which I kind of thought about the politics of space in that sense, well, one of the things was that because it was about growing a garden, it made me really think about land and the land that the gate occupied and what that land might be used for if it wasn't a theatre, and how it might kind of serve different functions, and how really simply, I suppose, if you were to co-opt that land that was used as a theatre and use it to grow things, what that would kind of do to the function of that space, to the way that the community around that space might relate to it, but also the way that the all of the different kind of members of a theatre making team, I suppose, would be forced to kind of interact with that plot of land, you know, with care, with attention, with some level of kind of listening, and that there could be, I suppose it's like a future theatre in my imagination, which is a theatre of like mutual collaboration with space, collaboration with materials, as opposed to like what can often feel quite like violent, I think quite brutal ways of interacting with our theatre spaces, which is just like they have to kind of bend to the wills of this specific director or this specific designer, or they have to every time you make something new in them, you kind of rip out what was there before and just place something new in it, but trying to kind of imagine a new something that has a slightly more sensitive relationship. Yeah.
one of the things you talked about, I think in the stage article, was about the kind of position of a theatre within a community, and you were talking about the idea that that maybe theatres need to have designers or artists attached to them or long term, and those people should be kind of embedded into the community, and how the spaces of that make theatre can kind of respond and encompass those communities. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't fully understand how that would work, not being a producer or but I really have this feeling that like theatre design is this like has, especially a kind of theatre designer who could work in a long-term way with a theatre, and kind of like with like quite a lot of regularity. That's like a really kind of amazing opportunity, because you're like reconfiguring the like material of the world, or like reimagining the world in a really kind of practical way. And that feels like something that people really need to do at the moment, like reimagine. And I suppose in that thinking, it's like who is a theatre designer, who could be a scenographer, and feels like so many different sorts of people could work in with that kind of in mind, if we kind of got rid of some of the excess stuff that could be reimagined or more flexible. Then it feels like, what would it mean to say if in London you had to say, if one of the conversations they were having at the gate was like, what would it be if like on the board of the gate was like also people that organize carnival, or like what would it mean if yeah, like a theatre designer was a local sculptor, or a town, someone who worked with town planning, or just like a kind of, I guess, creative member of that community. And what would it mean, like in terms of like what the designs would kind of look like, and and also what design could mean. I mean, like, what I always think it's like kind of crazy that we have these like big spaces in central London with like all of these resources, electricity, power, like water, all of these things, like, but they're empty most of the day. Like, how could a set be kind of this multifunctional space, or like and then like how, if we could like reimagine these spaces, I suppose like the kind of question is like, how could theatres be these like porous things in a location, rather than what can often, I don't know about other people, but I feel like when I go and work in like another city or whatever, I just feel like I'm kind of like a spaceship, just like kind of landing in this place. It can often feel like, as the makers of a show, you're kind of like have some kind of position of authority or something, or like that's the kind of exchange that's happening, and you're almost like, this is good, or this is something that you should enjoy, or like this is like good art or something that we're bringing somewhere, rather than being like, what would it mean to kind of like make aesthetic choices, or choices like in a more porous way, I suppose. And one of the things I was thinking about is like, what would a theatre space or a theatre design space look like if it was designed by like 15-year-old girls from Peckham? I've got no idea, because I don't think that anyone's ever asked. There's so many versions of reconfiguration that I think could be really empowering and radical and exciting for people other than like, I don't know, the 50 set designers that work in the UK.
Do you think you would be able to think of some things that you feel like organisations could do maybe design schools could do that could kind of help with the kind of problems that you sort of, and the questions that you bring up?
Well, one of the things I felt like was a bit of wasn't great about the kind of way that I was educated, and I don't know, it's hard to know like kind of what's happening everywhere, but that there was like wasn't much, it felt like there was a kind of system of making theatre that you were going to go into, and it was very rigid, and it already kind of had all of its rules, and you just kind of needed, you know, you could kind of innovate within the space of the stage, but beyond that the systems were quite rigid. And I think design, you know, design isn't just kind of like aesthetically what's happens, it's also designing like systems and structures and all of those things. And I think in terms of design education, being like how do we make, and how do we make, and why do we make in that way? And I think if theatre making has like a power, like a kind of power for the future, in a big kind of meaningful way, it's like this space to reimagine, and like the kind of systemic problems that are in the world are all to do with these like systems that are kind of almost like invisible, capitalism, or, you know, whatever. And design, I think, is an amazing way to like kind of reimagine a system, even if it's just for like these 2 months of a rehearsal process. So I suppose in education, it's like being given the space to like reimagine the like actual the systems as well as the objects. And I suppose the same for kind of theatre institutions is what would be the biggest kind of change is like artists on full-time contracts, who kind of job is like an idea of like reimagining, I suppose, and given space to kind of enact those proposals. And I think there's like it feels like there's so many ways that you could kind of do that. Like, what if a designer also was responsible for making the marketing images? So you had one less person in the marketing department, but that was you know, like it feels like there's so many ways that you could kind of reimagine how we do what we do, that could give a bit more space to like the radical imagination and to making art, as opposed to this kind of like system that is very is really kind of just reproducing what's happening beyond the walls.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about is like something that you talk about in prayer, of this space of not really, of being able to question and acknowledge that you don't know the answers to everything, and maybe that the training has to kind of incorporate that as well, so allow people to go, I don't know, let's find a new way of doing it, or the institutions to have that kind of space as well. And
a kind of acknowledgement that like one of the things that I've been, because I'm doing a project at the moment, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is like, what does it mean to have like, to try and be like anti-assimilationist as a designer or as a practitioner? And that's like connected to all sorts of things for me, but one of the things that I keep thinking about is like multiples, and always thinking in multiples, and rather than there being a future, there's futures, and rather than being like a design, there's designs, and just that it's like all of, as soon as we kind of narrow things down to this like this one system or this one thing, it's like the answer's already kind of like predetermined, but trying to have space to be like, and I suppose that's like similar to an interest in materials that kind of like misbehave or something. It's like, how can we move from something that's like always this kind of iterative, not make it a little bit better and a little bit better until we have the perfect thing, being like there's no perfect solution. It's all about the kind of multiplicity of the world or something.
Yeah, I think sounds very exciting. Yeah. Okay, I think that's a good place to end then, with that sort of vision of how things could be. Thank you, Rosie.